Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Brooke Logan never imagined that a single secret from decades ago would rise up out of the shadows and rip apart every bond she ever built. But on this particular afternoon inside the Forrester mansion, the truth exploded with such force that it seemed to shake the entire foundation of the family itself, and Ridge Forrester, a man who had weathered scandals, betrayals, affairs, paternity swaps, and the most twisted romantic triangles imaginable, found himself face to face with the one revelation capable of breaking him in ways nothing else ever had as he screamed from a place deeper than anger or heartbreak. And oh, Hope is Ridge's daughter. A declaration so shocking, so impossible, so unthinkable that everyone in the room froze as if time itself slammed its brakes. Brooke stood in front of him, her breath unsteady, her eyes glassy as though a lifetime of guilt had finally surged to the surface, because she knew this day might come. She knew secrets always have expiration dates, especially in this family, and she knew Ridge would eventually piece it together. But she never expected it would happen like this in this moment, with Hope standing only a few feet away, trembling so violently that her entire sense of identity began to unravel. Hope had spent her life believing she was the daughter of Deacon Sharp, the child whose biological father was always dismissed as the dark mark on Brooke's past. Yet the truth, the devastating, world-shattering truth, was that decades ago Brooke had made a choice rooted in fear, shame, survival, and yes, love, but Ridge never knew the details. He only knew the Brooke he loved, the Brooke he hated, the Brooke he could never escape even when he ran to Taylor, Caroline, Quinn, Shauna, or any other woman. But now, as the truth unfolded in a series of flashbacks, accusations, and suffocating emotional tension, a secret history rewrote itself in real time. Brooke whispered Ridge's name as though it might calm him, but nothing could silence the roar that had erupted from inside him. He slammed his hand against the table, shaking the picture frames, and demanded Brooke say the words he couldn't quite process, that Hope, the young woman he had mentored, defended, supported, and in many ways guided as if she were extremely close to his heart, was actually his biological daughter. The memories surged through Ridge's mind like a hurricane. The nights he spent comforting Brooke during her most vulnerable moments, the complicated grief she carried after losing Bridget's father, the mysterious period of emotional distance when Brooke left town briefly in the 1990s, returning with a guardedness Ridge could never quite interpret. Brooke finally confessed that during one of her most chaotic separations from Ridge, long before Deacon ever entered the picture, she and Ridge had one final night, one final moment where they clung to each other, believing they were done for good. A night that resulted in a pregnancy she didn't know how to explain because Ridge was involved with Taylor at the time, and Brooke, terrified of ripping the family apart, terrified of destroying Ridge and Taylor's foundation yet again, convinced herself the only way forward was to bury the truth so deeply she could pretend it wasn't true. But fate twisted the situation even further, because when Brooke later became involved with Deacon, the timelines blurred, and the world naturally assumed Deacon was Hope's father. Brooke allowed the assumption to stand, believing it protected Ridge from more heartbreak, and protected Hope from being pulled into the endless Logan Forrester wars. Ridge gasped as though the air had been knocked out of him completely. He stared at Brooke like she was a stranger he'd never known, demanding again and again why she didn't tell him, why she stole from him the chance to raise his daughter, why he had poured his heart into Steffi, Thomas, and RJ believing they were his only biological ties when all along Hope, kind-hearted, principled, resilient Hope, was his as well. Hope stepped forward, tears streaming uncontrollably as she begged Brooke to tell her this wasn't real, that Ridge was mistaken, that her whole life wasn't built on a lie, but Brooke's silence, followed by a single broken nod, confirmed everything. The room filled with a suffocating mix of disbelief, pain, and betrayal as Ridge began pacing, running his hands through his hair, whispering, "I should have known. I always felt something. I always felt protective of her in a way that didn't make sense." And suddenly every moment between Ridge and Hope over the years replayed in his mind like puzzle pieces snapping into place. The walls seemed to close in as Thomas, who had been standing off to the side, felt his throat tighten. Hope, the woman he loved, the mother of his son, the person he had fought so hard for, was suddenly revealed to be his sister. His actual biological sister, and the horror of that realization made him stumble backward. Steffi clutched her chest, eyes wide with disbelief, muttering, "This changes everything. Everything. Because the Logan Forrester rivalry, one of the most iconic generational conflicts in soap opera history, had just been rewritten with one truth capable of dismantling decades of emotional warfare. Ridge shouted that he had a right to know his child, that he had missed Hope's entire childhood, that he had missed her school plays, her heartbreaks, her victories, her milestones, her struggles, and she had grown up believing she wasn't a Forrester when she was one all along. The weight of what Brooke had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. Taylor, who had been watching with stunned heartbreak, whispered in disbelief that this secret, was the one Brooke chose to build her life around, calling it the ultimate betrayal. Meanwhile, Deacon entered the house after receiving Hope's frantic call, only to walk into the emotional carnage and discover that the daughter he loved more than life itself, the daughter he fought for, cried for, cleaned himself up for, wasn't biologically his after all. Deacon's knees buckled as he stared at Brooke with a mixture of devastation and fury, asking how she could lie to him too, how she could let him believe for decades that Hope was his when she knew deep down there was a possibility Ridge fathered her. The emotional storm intensified as Brooke sobbed that she didn't know who the father was at first and was too terrified to tell the truth once Ridge went back to Taylor. She feared the revelation would destroy multiple families, feared it would make Hope feel unwanted, feared it would break Deacon's heart in Ridge's marriage, so she convinced herself that silence was protection. But that silence, like all secrets on The Bold and the Beautiful, had mutated into a catastrophic explosion. Ridge demanded a DNA test immediately, but his voice cracked when he looked at Hope and whispered, "If this is true, I lost my daughter before I even knew she was mine." Hope felt the world tilt, her hands shaking so violently that RJ rushed to her side, trying to steady her as she whispered that she didn't know who she was anymore. Brooke reached out, but Hope stepped back, unable to bear her mother's touch while her entire identity collapsed. Ridge turned toward Brooke, his voice raw, asking her why she always made choices for him, why she believed she had the right to control his life, his children, his destiny. He said he could forgive affairs, he could forgive heartbreak, but this stealing his daughter was unforgivable. Taylor stared at Brooke with a mixture of vindication and sorrow, realizing that every argument she had ever made about Brooke being reckless, selfish, impulsive, and destructive had just been proven in the worst way imaginable. Meanwhile, Steffi whispered that this revelation meant Hope was her sister too, but the idea made her physically ill. Decades of rivalry, jealousy, resentment, competition, accusations, sabotage. Everything suddenly became twisted and painful because she realized she had been fighting her own blood. The room descended into chaos as voices overlapped, Deacon shouting that Hope was still his daughter in every way that mattered, Ridge yelling that biology couldn't be ignored, Hope begging everyone to stop as she felt her chest tighten with panic, Thomas staring blankly as the foundation of his entire romantic world crumbled, Taylor insisting this was typical Brooke destruction, and Brooke collapsing to the floor in sobs as she begged Ridge to understand she never meant to hurt anyone. But the most heartbreaking moment came when Ridge approached Hope, not as a mentor, not as a stepfather, not as an ex-husband to her mother, but as a man whose life had just been rewritten, and whispered, "If this is true, you're my daughter, and I would have moved heaven and earth to protect you every single day of your life." Hope broke down completely, sobbing into her hands as the weight of this new identity crushed her. Ridge turned to Brooke, voice filled with ice and fire, saying, "You didn't just rewrite history. You destroyed it." And with that, he stormed out of the room, leaving Brooke collapsed, Hope shattered, and the Forrester family forever altered as the truth, Hope being Ridge's daughter, rewrote The Bold and the Beautiful in a way that no one could have ever predicted, with consequences that will echo through every relationship, every marriage, every rivalry, and every storyline yet to unfold. The moment Ridge stormed out of the Forrester mansion, slamming the heavy wooden door so violently the walls seemed to quake, it left behind a vacuum so crushingly silent that everyone inside felt the weight of abandonment settle over them like an icy fog, and Brooke, still trembling on the floor, gasped for breath as though her own lungs were betraying her, reaching out instinctively toward Hope, who remained frozen in place, her fingers curled tightly into fists as she fought against the overwhelming fear of what her life had just become, because nothing, absolutely nothing, felt real anymore. Deacon stood beside her, his chest heaving in a way that made him look like a man on the edge of collapse, and when he finally found his voice, it came out in a broken whisper, asking Brooke how she could do this, how she could steal fatherhood from him as easily as she had stolen it from Ridge, his eyes filling with something beyond pain, something deeper, a kind of devastation reserved For fathers who realize the child they shaped their life around was never biologically theirs, and Brooke, shaking, whispered that she never meant to hurt him, but Deacon cut her off with a bitter laugh, saying that intentions didn't erase the truth, intentions didn't rewrite the decades he spent trying to prove he was worthy of hope, the decades he fought to become a man she could be proud of, and now with one confession, Brooke had taken that from him. Hope finally stepped back, distancing herself from both her mother and the man she had called Dad her entire life. Her voice strained as she said she needed space, she needed air, she needed silence, because every sound felt like another blow to her senses, and Thomas, still reeling, muttered under his breath that everything he felt, everything he did, everything he fought for now felt twisted and sick, and the realization that the woman he had loved for so long was his sister tore into him. With a rawness that made him look physically ill as he staggered backward and braced himself against the mantel, staring blankly ahead like a man trying to claw his way out of his own mind. Steffi, meanwhile, had recovered just enough from the initial shock to start pacing the room like a caged animal, her breath coming out in sharp, frantic bursts as she kept whispering to herself, "This changes everything, everything." And then louder, turning on Brooke with a glare so intense it could have cut glass, she accused her of rewriting history for her own selfish benefit, of manipulating the entire family, of destroying their lives with her pattern of lies, and Brooke sobbed that she was trying to protect everyone, but Steffi laughed, cold, cutting, saying Brooke never protected anyone but herself, that she always acted first and worried about consequences later, consequences that now included detonating the Forrester family legacy in one afternoon. Hope flinched at Steffi's words, stepping away from her, her voice breaking as she begged Steffi not to make this worse, saying she didn't even know who she was anymore and she couldn't handle being attacked on top of everything else. But Steffi, fueled by fear and betrayal, snapped that Hope didn't get to play victim, not when the truth revealed she had been Ridge's daughter all along, a Forrester by blood, a sister to Steffi and Thomas, and suddenly every competition, every fight, every resentment became tragic, twisted, and sickening, and Steffi's voice cracked as she screamed that she felt violated by the revelation, violated by the idea that she spent years resenting someone who was family blood, someone she should have protected rather than fought. Donna, who had been standing off to the side in stunned silence, finally knelt beside Brooke, brushing her hair back gently as Brooke cried into her hands, whispering that the truth will come out, that Ridge just needed time to process, but Brooke shook her head violently, saying she could see the hatred in his eyes, the betrayal, the heartbreak. And she knew, deep inside, in a place she never admitted even to herself, that this secret would eventually destroy her marriage, her relationships, her reputation, everything she built with Ridge through decades of heartbreak and reconciliation. Eric, who had been upstairs resting, descended only because the shouting had grown too loud to ignore, and when he reached the bottom of the stairs, he stopped cold as he surveyed the carnage unfolding across his living room. His voice trembled as he asked what happened, and Steffi, raw, furious, whirled around and told him everything, every detail, every word, and Eric's face blanched as he stared at Brooke, whispering that this was the most devastating betrayal he had ever witnessed in their family, more shocking than any affair, any paternity twist, any scandal, because Brooke had taken a daughter from Ridge, taken Hope from her father, and rewritten the Forrester line without anyone's knowledge. Hope collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands as memories flooded her mind. Birthdays where Ridge had smiled warmly at her, encouraging her, supporting her, moments she dismissed as kindness but now realized felt almost paternal. She whispered that she didn't know what to do, didn't know how to look at Ridge ever again, didn't know how Deacon fit into her future, didn't know how to reconcile that the man who raised her wasn't her father, and the man she grew up idolizing in secret admiration was, and the world felt like it was spinning off its axis. Deacon rushed to her, crouching in front of her, gently taking her hands, saying she was still his daughter, she would always be his daughter, nothing could ever take that from him. But Hope shook her head violently, screaming that everything had changed, that nothing made sense anymore, and Deacon's heart shattered as he realized Hope wasn't just losing her identity, she was losing him too. Thomas suddenly turned toward the door with a fierce determination arising in his eyes, saying he had to find Ridge, he had to talk to him, he had to confirm the timeline, because if Hope truly was his sister, then every intense moment they ever shared was now twisted beyond repair, and he couldn't breathe until he knew the truth. Steffi tried to stop him, saying Ridge needed space, but Thomas insisted that if anyone understood the chaos of this revelation, it was him, because he was the one who loved Hope, He was the one who built his future around her. He was the one who risked everything for her. Only to find out that fate itself had betrayed him. Taylor, who had been on her way to the house after receiving frantic messages from Steffi, burst through the door just as Thomas reached for it, and when she saw Brooke sobbing, Hope shaking, Eric stunned and Deacon seething, she immediately knew this was no ordinary fight. Steffi ran to her mother and clung to her, whispering that everything was falling apart, everything was wrong, everything was twisted, and when Taylor demanded answers, Steffi told her the truth. Ridge believed Hope was his daughter and Brooke had known for decades. Taylor's face hardened instantly, every neuron firing with a mixture of fury, betrayal, and vindicated rage as she rounded on Brooke and began demanding details. When did she know? How long did she hide it? What made her think she had the right to make decisions about Ridge's family without consulting him? How could she let Taylor raise a family with Ridge while hiding his daughter from him? Brooke tried to speak, but Taylor drowned her out, screaming that Brooke had destroyed yet another generation of Forresters, accusing her of ripping apart Ridge's heart not once, not twice, but now in a way that could never be repaired. Taylor said this wasn't an affair, wasn't a mistake, wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a lifelong lie. Hope sobbed harder, begging Taylor to stop, saying she couldn't handle being the center of a war she never asked for. But Taylor snapped that Hope deserved the truth too, and that Brooke was at fault for all of it. The room felt like a battlefield, every voice rising higher, every accusation sharper, until finally Hope stood, shaking so violently that her knees nearly buckled, and she screamed for everyone to stop. Just stop, because she couldn't breathe, she couldn't think, she couldn't survive this if the people she loved kept tearing each other apart. And then in a voice barely above a whisper, she said she needed Ridge. She needed to hear from him what this meant. She needed to understand how he felt. She needed to look into his eyes and know whether he saw her as a daughter or as another betrayal in a lifetime filled with Brooke's chaos. Brooke begged her not to go after Ridge, saying he needed to cool off, but Hope ignored her, wiping her tears as she stepped toward the door. Her voice hollow as she said she didn't even know if she could look at Brooke again after what she had done. Deacon tried to follow, but Hope gently pushed him away, saying she needed to do this alone. And when the door closed behind her, the entire room felt like it exhaled a breath it had been holding for decades. Brooke watched her daughter walk away, feeling as though her soul was being torn from her body, whispering that she might have just lost everything. Her husband, her daughter, her family, her reputation, and Taylor with cold, quiet fury, responded that for once Brooke was right. Because this time Brooke Logan's secret hadn't just damaged the family. It had rewritten its entire history. Hope stepped into the cold evening air, her breath hitching as she wrapped her arms around herself, as though trying to hold together the pieces of a life that no longer fit, and the moment the heavy Forrester doors shut behind her, the muffled shouting inside became nothing more than a distant hum, leaving her alone with the crushing sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She walked down the stone steps slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, her mind spinning as she whispered to herself over and over, "I need to see him. I need to see him." Because in this chaos, the only person who could give her any clarity was Ridge, the man who had been a comforting presence in her life without her ever fully understanding why. She reached her car with trembling hands, fumbling with the keys, her vision blurring as tears streamed unchecked down her face, and after climbing into the driver's seat, she gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, whispering to the empty air, "Please don't hate me, please don't hate me," even though deep inside she feared the opposite, that Ridge might look at her for the first time not with disappointment or irritation, but with a pain she couldn't bear to cause. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Brooke dragged herself to her feet, her legs like jelly beneath her, her voice raw as she called out after Hope even though she knew Hope was long gone, and Taylor, narrowing her eyes, told her sharply that chasing after Hope now would only make things worse, that Hope needed space to process the destruction Brooke had caused, and Donna, ever the peacemaker, placed a hand on Brooke's shoulder and whispered that they would fix this somehow, but Brooke shook her head helplessly, her voice cracking as she said she didn't know if this was fixable. Didn't know if Ridge would ever forgive her for taking away the one thing he always wanted. Another daughter. Deacon, pacing like a storm barely contained, muttered that none of them understood what this meant for him, that Hope had been the center of his world, the reason he redeemed himself, the reason he fought so hard to stay clean, and now he wasn't sure she would ever look at him the same again, because biology had a cruel way of rewriting someone's identity even when it didn't change their heart. Upstairs, Eric slowly sank into an armchair, rubbing his forehead as if trying to relieve the pressure of decades of family warfare crashing down yet again, whispering that he had seen many scandals in his lifetime. Paternity swaps, betrayals, affairs, lies, but nothing compared to this, because this didn't just shift loyalties. It shattered the foundation of the Forrester family tree. Steffi stood in the middle of the room, staring at the door Hope had exited through, her chest rising and falling sharply as she whispered, almost to herself, "She's my sister." And the words tasted foreign, heavy, unbelievable on her tongue, because for years she had battled Hope with a ferocity born of rivalry, never knowing that every blow, every insult, every competition had been a tragic mistake. And downstairs, Thomas leaned against the wall, eyes unfocused, whispering one sentence over and over like a broken prayer. "She was never mine," as the truth settled deep into his bones. The truth that their story was never meant to be a love story, but a cruel twist of fate neither of them could have foreseen or escaped.